I rise to come to the floor today to bring to the Senate's attention and to the Congress's attention a great challenge that we have before us relative to the budget of the Department of Homeland Security. And frankly, it's a challenge facing the entire budget of the United States. And that challenge, Madam President, is to make sure that we have enough funding in the disaster emergency account to cover the multitude of disasters that have taken place this year, just since January, as well as those that we are still recovering from some years in the past. I'd like to put up a chart, if I could, just to show in dramatic fashion the really unprecedented situation that we're facing. And that is, Madam President, that since January of this year, 36 states have had disasters declared. This may be the largest number of states in the shortest period of time, at least in recent memory, and could potentially be in history. And this is a challenge to the budget because, as you know, under our law, the federal government is, by law, and it attempts to be every day, a reliable and trustworthy partner for cities and towns and states that have been devastated by either tornadoes, wildfires, hurricanes, etc. Most recently, our minds and our eyes and our hearts have been focused on Missouri with the terrible devastation to several of their cities, most notably Joplin, Missouri, just recently. But we remember just a few weeks ago the tornadoes that ripped through the southern part of the United States, in Alabama, particularly Georgia, some parts of Arkansas, and flooding in other parts of the country as well. Now, this is what Mother Nature has brought to us, and we can't control that. But what we can control is how we respond to it, and that's what I want to speak to today. I'd like to begin with a quote from David Maxwell from the Arkansas Department of Emergency Management. He said in the Washington Post on April 30th, he was recorded as saying, "Anything that we've asked for, they've gotten us," and he was referring to FEMA. Greg Flynn, a spokesman with the Mississippi Emergency Management Agency, said of Fugate, FEMA is just unbelievably proactive towards the states. They don't wait for things to happen. By the time the storm is out of the way, they want to know what we need. Madam President, this is very good testimony because we've worked hard. Many of us, you've been a part of this, I most certainly have, and others, to make a better FEMA, a stronger FEMA, a more proactive FEMA, and I think in large measure we've accomplished that, although there are still challenges before that agency. But the biggest challenge right now is, unless the Senate and the House and the President do something differently, we are not going to have the money we need to take care of these disasters. And so, for people on the ground like David Maxwell in Arkansas and in Greg Flynn in Mississippi, and whether it's Paul Rainwater, who's the CEO of my state and still struggling in the aftermath of Katrina and Rita, which was 6 years ago, but a disaster that's still open, we literally are going to run out of money in the Disaster Emergency Relief Fund January of this year. So let me put up a chart to show the challenge that's before us. We have, the President has requested $1.8 billion, which is a reasonable request based on past averages of disasters, which we're prepared to budget in the base budget of Homeland Security. But unfortunately, the estimate of the low end of these disasters, again, 36 since January 1st, and disasters open in all 50 states, the low estimate is that we need $3.8 billion at the low end, and the high end is $6.6. So somewhere between $3.5 and $6.5 billion is required, but we have budgeted only $1.8. in the base of Homeland Security. As chair of this committee, I can tell you that our committee cannot absorb in its base the entire weight and cost of these disasters. The Homeland Security budget has never in its history since it was created absorbed 100%. We do a rough and good faith estimate of what it might be, but these are exceeding even our expectations of what the disasters would be. And of course, no one is in a position to be able to foretell the future. Our Secretary of Homeland Security has brought a great deal of skill and expertise, a former governor, an excellent manager, all the prerequisite academic credentials, but she didn't show up in this job with a magic wand and a foreteller's globe. She doesn't have those tools available to her to be able to see in the future every disaster and what kind of disaster is going to happen to the country. All we can come forward with in our budget is a good faith estimate, which we did at $1.8 billion. So the reason I come to the Senate today is to say that there is a gap that must be filled. I'm strongly recommending that this Congress fund this off budget in an emergency line item, which is what we've done 95% of the time in the last 40 years. $110 billion of emergencies out of 130 have been dealt with as true emergencies. It's unpredictable. You can't plan for it. We must respond by law. And if we don't, then projects all over this country will shut down. And I might remind everyone that it's projects that create jobs, that not only restore hope, not only rebuild communities, but projects that create jobs. To list a few of them, the repairs for two very important roads in Hawaii could potentially be stopped. Sewer line repairs and a pump station in Gary, Indiana could be stopped. The town hall in the village of Gulfport, which hasn't been rebuilt for 6 years since the storm, which is under construction, could be halted. A dozen or more jobs in that small town of Gulfport. Not big numbers nationally, but important to that city. My strong recommendation is that we do what we've always done, which is appropriate in funding real emergencies. Now, it's not appropriate to do off budget on things that you can budget for, you should have budgeted for, and you just failed to budget for. That's not an emergency. That's bad planning. But Madam President, I think I'm a pretty good chairman of this committee. I know Secretary Napolitano is an excellent administrator of Homeland Security. There's nothing we could give her humanly possible where she can predict in the future what kinds of disasters are going to take place and the magnitude of their destruction. It's impossible. So again, we have to figure out a way to budget for this that's responsible, and I say put a good faith effort or average in your budget, and then anything that occurs, do it off, in addition to that, off budget in emergency. Or another suggestion, which is met with resistance, and I can understand why, but another reasonable alternative would be to take a percentage decrease against all the budgets of the federal government and just say, we wanted to spend this money, but we've had these disasters, and absorb it, government-wide. I can promise you the last and worst thing, and one that can happen, because I will oppose it vigorously, and so will many others, is taking the entire amount of the DRF, the Disaster Emergency Fund, out of the Homeland Security budget, because then you put the country in a position that you're underfunding planning for the future, lowering your defenses against real terrorist attacks that could potentially happen to the country because you're funding for disaster levels that were completely we were unable to plan for them for obvious reasons. So we cannot undermine the security of our nation. We cannot undermine and weaken the entire Homeland Department's budget because of an unusual natural occurrence of which we have no control over and no foreknowledge of. Now, there may be other solutions that I haven't thought of. Another would be very helpful if the President himself, knowing these numbers, they come from his own executive agencies, are tabulating these numbers, for him to send an emergency supplemental. I've sent him several letters requesting that he send to the Congress an emergency supplemental to cover this gap. If he doesn't or does not do that, Congress itself has the power to act, and I will be making a recommendation to, in Appropriations Committee, to fill this gap. But what is not acceptable is to try to absorb this entire gap in the Homeland Security budget, which will leave our country in a very weakened position in terms of preparing for future disasters and potential terrorist attacks. Might I remind everyone that hurricane season just started June 1st. It's now June 15th. We're 15 days into hurricane season. We don't know what this season will bring. And there may be other alternatives to closing this gap, but it is very, very important. I'm going to start work on this vigorously with my ranking member, Senator Coates, to see what we can recommend potentially jointly together. And if not, I would hope that every senator, and again, I'd like to put this chart up, this would be just about every senators from Washington to Texas to Nebraska to North Carolina, to Florida, to Georgia, Arizona. Montana will be green shortly, and so will Vermont, because there are disasters underway. If you'd put your thinking caps on, because we need to come up with a way to fund these disasters. And it's going to be a big challenge as we start our appropriations process. I'm going to submit more technical information to the record, but again, we don't have magic wands and crystal balls in the Department of Homeland Security. We have a lot of tools there to protect our country and to build after disasters, but magic wands and crystal balls are not available. So we have to come up with a way to close this gap that makes sense, and I trust over the next couple of weeks and months we'll be able to do that.